Picture a country at the edge of Europe, long winters, rocky soil, and a coastline so jagged it looks like the land was torn open by the sea. For most of its history, this was not a rich place. People fished, farmed what they could, cut timber, and hoped the weather wouldn't turn against them. If you had asked anyone here 100 years ago whether this country would one day be among the richest on earth, they probably would have laughed and gone back to mending nets. And yet, today, this country sits on a mountain of wealth so large it almost feels fictional. Not just rich in the everyday sense of high incomes or modern cities, but rich in a deeper, more unsettling way. Rich enough that it could spend far more than it does, raise living standards even higher, cut taxes dramatically, or shower every citizen with cash. And still it doesn't. It saves. Quietly. Patiently. Almost stubbornly. So how did that happen? How does a relatively small country end up controlling one of the largest pools of financial assets in the world? And, maybe more interestingly, why does it refuse to spend most of it? To understand this, you have to forget the oil rig for a moment. That's the part everyone jumps to. Oil is important, yes, but oil alone doesn't explain this story. Plenty of countries found oil and ended up poorer, more unstable, or trapped in cycles of boom and bust. History is full of those examples. The difference here starts much earlier, long before anyone drilled into the seabed. This country learned, slowly and often painfully, what scarcity feels like. For centuries, survival depended on planning ahead. You couldn't just consume everything you had in a good year, because the bad years always came. That mindset, shaped by geography and climate, created habits that matter a lot in finance. Patience, caution, and a deep respect for risk. Then there's timing. When oil was discovered offshore in the late 20th century, this country wasn't desperate or institutionally weak. It already had a functioning democracy, a strong civil service, and a public that was deeply suspicious of letting private interests run wild with national resources. Instead of asking, how fast can we get rich? The more interesting question was, how do we avoid ruining ourselves? That question shaped everything that followed. Oil revenues didn't flow straight into government budgets to be spent as quickly as possible. They were treated as something temporary, almost dangerous if handled poorly. A windfall, yes, but also a test of discipline. The challenge wasn't how to extract wealth from the ground. It was how to stop that wealth from distorting the economy, inflating prices, and hollowing out other industries. This is where the story takes its most unusual turn. Instead of letting oil money flood the domestic economy, most of it was pushed outward, invested abroad, converted into ownership of companies, bonds, and assets all over the world. In a sense, the country decided not to be rich at home. At least, not all at once. Think about how strange that is. Imagine discovering a massive source of income and then choosing not to spend it, not to show it off, not even to feel it fully in your day-to-day life. Why do that? Because history had taught a brutal lesson. Easy money can make you weaker, not stronger, if it replaces work, productivity, and long-term thinking. There's debate among economists about how much of this success comes from culture, how much from institutions, and how much from sheer luck. Was it inevitable, or could things have gone very differently with just a few bad decisions? That question matters because it reminds us this wasn't magic. It was choice layered on top of circumstance. And that brings us to the quiet paradox at the heart of this story. This country is wealthy not because it spends freely, but because it restrains itself. It treats national wealth less like a jackpot and more like an inheritance, something you're borrowing from the future rather than consuming in the present. In a world obsessed with growth, consumption, and instant gratification, that's an odd way to behave. Almost unnatural, which raises the final question we'll keep coming back to. In a global economy that rewards speed and risk-taking, can patience really be a competitive advantage? Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because Norway's riches didn't start as a "we struck oil and everyone bought sports cars" moment. It started as a series of decisions made by people who were almost suspicious of good fortune. Go back a little. For a long time, Norway was a relatively modest economy on the European edge. It had shipping, fisheries, hydropower, timber, some industry, and a lot of hard-earned competence. It also had a clear memory of what it meant to be a smaller country, trying to stay stable in a world that doesn't always reward stability. In other words, Norway wasn't entering the oil era as a fragile state with weak institutions. It was entering it with a functioning democracy and a public sector that could actually implement rules. Then, in 1969, oil was discovered at Ekofisk in the North Sea, and by 1971 production was underway. That's the hinge point. Because oil can be a blessing, but it can also be an economic prank. It hands you a river of money and then dares you to drink the whole thing at once. Norway's early instinct was basically, okay, but who's in charge here? In 1971, Norway's parliament laid out principles that later became known as the 10 Oil Commandments, emphasizing national control and that petroleum should benefit the whole country, not just a few lucky winners. Around the same era, Norway created a state oil company, Statoil, now Equinor, to build domestic capability and make sure the state had a strong seat at the table. This matters for finance because the biggest question with oil isn't how much is underground. It's who captures the profits and how. Norway set up a system where the state, through taxes, ownership stakes, and licensing, captured a large share of the resource rent. And once you have that, you face the next problem. What happens when a national budget gets hooked on oil money? Here's the danger in plain terms. Oil revenue comes in waves. Prices rise, prices fall. Production rises, production falls. If you spend like the good times will last forever, you can end up with a public sector that expands fast and booms and panics and busts. That's not just stressful. It can permanently damage the regular economy. When easy money floods in, the currency can strengthen, wages can rise quickly, and suddenly your non-oil exporters look expensive and uncompetitive. Economists call one version of this Dutch disease, but you don't need the label to understand the feeling. Your economy starts acting like it's only built for one big payday. So Norway did something that sounds boring, almost rude, like refusing dessert at a party. It built a buffer. In 1990, Norway established what was originally called the Government Petroleum Fund, later the Government Pension Fund Global. The idea wasn't, let's become a financial superpower. It was, let's keep oil money from whipping our economy around. And crucial detail, the first transfer of money into the fund didn't happen immediately. The first capital transfer came in 1996. Why the delay? Because a fund only works if it's connected to the budget system in a disciplined way. Norway's approach, simplified, was to treat petroleum revenue as government income and then route the surplus into the fund. The fund became the place where oil wealth could be converted into financial assets. And crucially, most of those assets were invested abroad. That abroad part is the secret sauce people miss. If Norway had poured all the money straight into domestic spending, bigger budgets, higher salaries, huge projects everywhere, it could have overheated its own economy. Instead, investing abroad helped reduce pressure at home. It also turned a single national resource into a diversified portfolio. Ownership in thousands of companies, plus bonds, and other assets across global markets. And over time, that shift becomes dramatic. A huge share of the fund's value ends up coming not from new oil money, but from investment returns. For example, Norges Bank Investment Management reports that by September 30th, 2025, the fund's value was 20,440 billion Norwegian kroner, and more than half of the fund's value was return on investments. At this point, a normal human question kicks in. If you have that much money, why not use it? This is where Norway's "we don't spend it" reputation really comes from. Norway built a spending rule, often described as using only the fund's expected long-run real return, rather than touching the principal. The government has described how the expected real return was initially set at 4% and later reduced to 3% in 2017. In the 2026 budget context, Norway's government projected fund spending around 2.8% of the fund's value, still under that 3% guideline. You can think of it like this. Norway tried to treat oil wealth like a one-time inheritance that gets invested, and then you live off the dividend rather than selling the house. Let's make that feeling real with a quick thought experiment. Imagine you end up with $100 million. Not in a fantasy, I'm going to buy a private jet. Way, just a serious sum that could change your life. You could spend it fast, nicer car, bigger rent, help everyone, solve everything today. But if you spend it fast, it's gone fast. Now imagine you put that 100 million Nigerian Naira's dollars into a diversified investment portfolio, and you tell yourself, I'm only going to withdraw a small, sustainable amount each year, so this supports me for decades. That approach feels slower, until you realize it's the difference between a temporary upgrade and permanent security. Norway basically scaled that logic to a whole country. And there's another twist. The fund isn't just a savings account. It's also a shock absorber. Oil prices can crash. Global markets can swing. Domestic needs can rise. By not spending everything in good times, Norway keeps room to maneuver in bad times. That's a finance lesson dressed up as national policy. Volatility is expensive when you're forced to act at the worst possible moment. Of course, none of this means Norway never spends. It does. It uses the fund to help finance government budgets, but it tries to do it in a way that's predictable and sustainable rather than boom and bust. That predictability is underrated. If you're a teacher, a nurse, a builder, or a business owner, a stable economy is like good plumbing. You only notice it when it breaks. It also helps that the fund's purpose was framed as intergenerational from the start. Today's citizens shouldn't treat a finite resource as if it belongs only to them. That framing doesn't eliminate political debate, but it changes the default expectation. The question becomes less, how do we spend the treasure? And more, how do we avoid getting addicted to the treasure? And yes, there are debates inside this story. Some economists emphasize institutions and governance as the decisive factor. Others argue that culture and social trust made strong institutions possible. Some point out that Norway's advantages, like a strong state before oil, a small population, and a high-capacity public administration, are not easily copy-pasted elsewhere. Those debates matter because they keep the story honest. Norway's outcome wasn't guaranteed. It was a path. But the big through line is clear. Norway got rich by treating oil as a temporary windfall and converting it into a long-lived financial machine. And Norway doesn't spend it because it decided early on that the real risk wasn't poverty anymore. It was losing control of itself when the money arrived. So when people ask, how did Norway get rich? The satisfying answer is oil. But the honest answer is tougher. Norway got rich because it treated oil like a test of character. Because oil isn't just money. It's a mood. It changes how a country feels about time. Suddenly tomorrow looks optional. Suddenly patience feels unnecessary. And that's where the danger lives. Norway's story is basically a long negotiation with temptation. The temptation to spend quickly. The temptation to build a whole national identity around a single revenue stream. The temptation to confuse a high bank balance with real strength. And instead, Norway tried to do something almost unglamorous. It turned a finite resource into a financial engine designed to outlive the resource itself. That's why the fund matters, but not in the wow, big number way. It matters because it created distance between the money and the moment. It built a pause, a speed bump, a system that says, yes, the cash is real, but no, we're not going to let today's excitement rewrite tomorrow's options. If you zoom out, that's the core finance lesson hiding inside a national story. Wealth isn't just what you earn. Wealth is what you don't let yourself do when you earn it. And that's also why Norway doesn't spend it, at least not the way outsiders expect. Not because Norwegians hate nice things. Not because they enjoy suffering in minimalist silence while sitting on a pile of assets. It's because they understand something basic about windfalls. They can make you lazy, loud, and fragile. Sometimes all at once. Think about it like this. If your income doubles tomorrow, what's the first thing that changes? Your future or your lifestyle? Most of us feel the pull to upgrade life immediately because life is happening now. Totally human. But then the upgrades become fixed costs. The bigger rent becomes normal. The new spending becomes routine. And if the income falls again, you don't just lose money, you lose stability. Now scale that up to a whole country. Oil prices rise, government revenue rises, the economy heats up, expectations rise. Then prices fall, and suddenly you're not just balancing a budget, you're managing a national emotional crash. People don't protest because numbers changed. They protest because promises changed. That's the real volatility cost. Not the math, the psychology. So Norway's restraint is not an aesthetic choice. It's risk management. It's also humility, and that part is underrated. Because a lot of countries hit one lucky era and start acting like they're permanently brilliant. Norway tried to avoid that. It treated its oil wealth like it was borrowed time, not a new personality. Now here's where the story gets spicy, because this is the point where someone usually says, okay, so why doesn't everyone do this? And the answer is, because it's hard, it's boring, it's politically uncomfortable. It forces you to tell people no while there's money on the table. It forces leaders to accept less applause today in exchange for fewer disasters tomorrow. It forces a country to agree on rules that survive elections, headlines, and the very human urge to win the present. And that leads me to the one statement that tends to make people sit up straight, because it sounds harsh even when it's true. Here it is. Oil wealth and democracy are a dangerous combination unless you lock the money away from yourself. Not because democracy is bad, not because voters are foolish, but because incentives are real. If a system rewards whoever promises the fastest spending, then the political market will eventually produce fast spenders. And if the money is easy, the promises get easier. That's not a moral critique. That's just how competition works. Norway's genius was admitting that out loud, then designing a system that protects the country from its own short-term impulses. That's controversial because we like stories where good outcomes come from good intentions. But in finance, good outcomes usually come from good guardrails. And you can actually feel this in the tone of Norway's approach. It's not "we're rich, watch us." It's "we might be rich, but we're not going to act like it's permanent." It's an almost parental attitude toward money. Like the country looked at its own bank statement and said, "You're not spending this unsupervised." Now, does that mean Norway's approach is perfect? No. Every system has trade-offs. There are debates about how much should be spent domestically, how to balance present needs with future saving, how ethical investing should work, and what happens as the world changes and energy transitions accelerate. Those are real questions, and smart people disagree on details. But the direction of the story still holds. Norway built a habit of thinking in decades instead of quarters. And that habit is rare. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, okay, cool national story, what does that have to do with me? It actually has a lot to do with you, because most of us don't get oil. We get smaller windfalls, a bonus, a big client, a side hustle that suddenly works, a season where money flows more than usual. And in those moments, the same test appears, just on a smaller stage. Do you convert the windfall into a lifestyle you now have to defend every month? Or do you convert it into freedom? Do you spend it in a way that makes you feel rich, or invest it in a way that keeps you safe? Do you treat it like a reward for the present, or an upgrade for the future? Norway's story isn't telling you to never enjoy money. It's telling you that the real flex is control. The real power is being able to say not yet when you absolutely could say yes right now. So here's my question for you. If you suddenly had a big financial windfall tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd do and why? Would you spend it, save it, invest it, help family, pay down debt, start something? No judgment. I'm genuinely curious, because the why behind your answer is usually more revealing than the answer itself. Drop your experience in the comments. Tell me what you've seen in your own life, your family, your workplace, your country, anything. Have you ever watched someone's income rise and their stress rise with it? Have you ever seen a season of abundance go wrong because there were no rules? Or have you seen the opposite, where discipline quietly changed everything? I'll be reading the comments, and I'll reach out and respond to as many as I can, because this topic isn't really about Norway in the end. It's about what money does to humans when it shows up faster than wisdom. And if there's one takeaway to hold on to, it's this: Norway didn't just find wealth. It managed the moment wealth arrived. That's the part most people miss. That's the part that actually makes you rich.